She crossed an ocean believing love was waiting. What she found instead was a secret growing inside someone she trusted with her life. How does a marriage collapse without violence? Only lies, silence, and calculated betrayal. This is not just a story about an affair. It's about how manipulation becomes a crime long before anyone realizes they're a victim. January 2018 arrived quietly on the island, carried in by warm trade winds and the low rhythm of waves brushing the shore. From the outside, her life looked settled, even peaceful. She worked, she waited, she believed. Each morning began with the same ritual. Checking her phone for a message from Toronto, searching for proof that distance had not thinned devotion. Some days there was nothing. On others, a brief line appeared, affectionate but oddly restrained, as if carefully measured before being sent. She told herself this was normal. Long-distance marriages demanded patience, trust, and sacrifice. He had left for opportunity, for stability, for a future they had planned together. She stayed behind, holding the shape of that promise, counting months instead of days. When calls were missed, she excused them as exhaustion. When his laughter sounded delayed, she blamed poor connections. Love, she believed, required interpretation. The idea of a surprise visit formed slowly, almost shyly. It began as a thought she pushed away, then returned to again and again. If she appeared without warning, she imagined, his face would light up. Distance would collapse into touch. Whatever tension lingered in their conversations would dissolve under the weight of shared air. She did not see the decision as risky. She saw it as hopeful. Buying the ticket felt like crossing a private threshold. At the travel agency, she smiled politely while her heart raced. The confirmation email arrived minutes later, its subject line unremarkable, its meaning enormous. She did not tell him. She wanted the moment to be pure, unfiltered by expectation. In her mind, secrecy was an act of love. Yet even as plans took shape, unease threaded through her excitement. Their recent calls had been shorter. His questions about her days felt scripted, as though he already knew the answers. Sometimes, she sensed him listening less than responding, filling space rather than sharing it. When she mentioned feeling lonely, he reassured her quickly, too quickly, his words polished and light. She replayed old messages at night, studying tone the way others read omens. Nothing was openly wrong, but something felt incomplete. Emotional weight had shifted, subtle but persistent, leaving her carrying more of the marriage than she remembered agreeing to. Still, she dismissed doubt as insecurity. Distance could distort perception. Trust meant resisting imagination. As departure day approached, she packed carefully, folding clothes with deliberate calm. She chose outfits he liked, colors he once complimented. Each item felt like a reminder of who she had been when they shared a home, a life unbroken by borders. At the airport, surrounded by strangers, she felt a flicker of fear she could not name. When the plane lifted, the island shrank beneath her, familiar and safe. Ahead waited a city of glass and cold, and a husband she believed was missing her just as deeply. She did not know that this journey was not toward reunion, but toward revelation. The silence she had been forgiving was already preparing to speak. As clouds closed around the aircraft, she rehearsed his smile, his surprise, the way he would reach for her hands. Somewhere between takeoff and landing, certainty gave way to anticipation. By the time the seatbelt sign dimmed, the story she believed in was already beginning to unravel quietly, unknowingly. The first nights in Toronto passed under the hum of unfamiliar sounds, radiators ticking and distant traffic replacing the ocean she was used to. Each evening, she waited for the moment he would relax, for conversation to settle into something intimate and unguarded. Instead, their exchanges felt timed, squeezed between obligations he rarely explained. Silence filled the spaces where warmth once lived. Phone calls had once been lifelines. Now they were brief check-ins, efficient and oddly professional. He asked about her flight, her meals, her rest, but rarely about her feelings. When she spoke too long, he gently redirected the conversation, reminding her of time, of work, of fatigue. She found herself editing emotions before voicing them, sensing that too much honesty might burden him. Money hovered quietly over everything. He paid the rent, handled expenses, reminded her, sometimes casually, sometimes pointedly, of the sacrifices he was making abroad. Gratitude mixed with dependence, blurring into obligation. She reassured him often, thanking him for providing, promising patience, promising understanding. Love began to sound like maintenance. At night, she replayed their calls in her head, searching for meaning between words. His tone remained calm, controlled, almost soothing, as if designed to prevent questions rather than invite them. When she asked when they would truly talk, he laughed softly and said soon, always soon. The future became a convenient placeholder. He spoke often about stress, long hours, responsibility, pressure she could not fully see. These explanations were consistent, polished, delivered with practiced ease. Each time, she accepted them, though a quiet part of her wondered why the same reasons surfaced so readily, like lines memorized rather than lived. Sometimes, connection flickered, a shared joke, a memory recalled. In those moments, she felt foolish for doubting him. She reminded herself that love across borders required compromise, that absence could change rhythm without changing intention. Yet the moments never lingered. They faded quickly, replaced by logistical talk and gentle goodbyes. She noticed how rarely he asked when she planned to return. When she hinted at staying longer, his responses were vague, neither encouraging nor refusing. It unsettled her more than outright objection would have. Indifference, she realized, could wound deeper than conflict. During the day, she walked the neighborhood alone, phone in hand, waiting for messages that arrived sporadically. When they did, they were affectionate but brief, carefully balanced, offering reassurance without vulnerability. She began to feel like a recipient of comfort rather than a partner in it. The power dynamic revealed itself slowly. He controlled the narrative of their distance, framing it as temporary hardship, necessary endurance. She absorbed that framing, repeating it to herself, to others, until it felt almost true. Yet something inside resisted, a small insistence that intimacy should not require translation. One evening, after another shortened call, she stared at the silent screen longer than usual. The room felt heavier, the city colder. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider that silence was not accidental. It was shaping something, protecting something, holding something back. As she prepared for bed, she resolved to pay closer attention, to listen not just to what he said, but to what he avoided. Distance, she realized, was no longer just geography. It was a language he spoke fluently, and she was only beginning to understand its meaning. Sleep came late, interrupted by thoughts she pushed aside for weeks. Tomorrow, she decided, she would stop smoothing over discomfort. She would watch reactions, measure pauses, and note contradictions. Whatever waited beneath the quiet, she sensed it would not stay hidden much longer. Not after everything she crossed. Morning light filtered weakly through the window as she prepared herself, adjusting her coat, steadying her breath. The decision she had made weeks earlier now stood fully formed in front of her. She did not call him. She did not message. She stepped outside into the Toronto cold, the air sharp enough to sting, carrying none of the softness she associated with home. Each step toward his apartment felt heavier than expected, as though the city itself resisted her presence. The building looked ordinary, almost disappointingly so. Concrete, glass, muted colors. This was where their future was being built, she reminded herself. She pressed the buzzer, heart quickening, rehearsing his surprise in her mind. Seconds stretched. When the door finally opened, his face registered recognition slowly. Confusion first, then composure. The smile followed, but it arrived late, as if summoned rather than spontaneous. He hugged her, brief and careful, his body stiff before relaxing. He said her name twice, laughed once, asked why she hadn't told him. She answered lightly, explaining the surprise, watching his eyes rather than his words. They darted past her, down the hallway, then back again. He took her bag, his movements efficient, practiced. Inside, The apartment felt impersonal. Clean, minimal, almost staged. She searched instinctively for traces of herself, for evidence she had been missed. Photos were absent. Familiar items were nowhere to be seen. He apologized for the mess, though there was none. Another small inconsistency, insignificant on its own. They sat. He offered water instead of tea, though he knew her preference. She told herself it was a small oversight. People changed. Cities changed people. Still, she noticed how often his phone buzzed, how quickly he silenced it, placing it face down on the table between them like a barrier. Conversation moved cautiously. He asked about her flight, her health, the weather back home. His questions followed a safe script. When she tried to talk about missing him, about loneliness, he responded with reassurance rather than reflection, smoothing emotion instead of meeting it. Felt less like reunion and more like negotiation. She watched his hands as he spoke, how they clasped together when she looked directly at him. When she mentioned staying longer than planned, his pause was brief but visible. He recovered quickly, saying they would talk about it later, always later. The word echoed faintly in her mind. As evening settled, the city lights flickered on outside the window, distant and cold. She felt strangely like a guest in her own marriage. Nothing overtly wrong revealed itself, yet everything felt slightly misaligned, like furniture shifted just enough to notice. He suggested dinner out, said it would be nice to celebrate her arrival. The choice felt intentional, a way to avoid the apartment, to avoid stillness. As they walked, she studied his stride, half a step ahead of hers, as if accustomed to walking alone. At the restaurant, he scanned the room before sitting. She noticed. She always noticed. The meal passed with polite laughter and surface-level conversation. He held her hand across the table, warm but distracted, his eyes drifting when her voice softened. Later, back in the apartment, she lay awake beside him, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the city and the even rhythm of his breathing. The man next to her felt close in distance, far in presence. She reminded herself that first days were awkward, that adjustment took time. Yet as she stared into the dark, the feeling from earlier returned, stronger now. The sense that something essential had already shifted before she arrived. Tomorrow, she thought, things would feel clearer. Tomorrow, the inconsistencies might arrange themselves into something she could finally name. The next morning unfolded with forced normalcy. He suggested coffee at a nearby cafe, explaining they might meet someone she would be happy to see. The word someone landed softly, without emphasis, as though unimportant. She followed him through unfamiliar streets, trusting his lead, grateful for any thread of familiarity in a city that still felt distant. Inside the cafe, warmth and noise wrapped around them. When the woman stood from a corner table, recognition struck instantly. She was a friend from home, someone who had shared birthdays, secrets, and long conversations that once stretched past midnight. Relief washed through her, followed closely by confusion. This was unexpected, but not unwelcome. They embraced. The hug lingered a second too long, or perhaps not long enough. The friend smiled brightly, her voice steady, asking about the flight, the weather, island life. Everything sounded rehearsed, though she could not say why. She told herself she was projecting unease where none existed. As they sat, she noticed the glances. Quick, almost imperceptible exchanges between the two, shared pauses when questions grew personal. When she joked about the surprise visit, laughter came a beat late from both of them. The rhythm felt practiced, like a performance perfected through repetition. The friend spoke about settling into the city, about adjusting, about opportunity. Her hand rested protectively near her abdomen, a gesture so casual it barely registered. The wife listened, nodding, comforted by the familiar accent, the shared history bridging distance. Yet beneath that comfort, tension hummed quietly. Conversation drifted toward memories from home. The friend recalled moments the husband did not seem to remember, correcting details, finishing sentences for him. Each interruption was gentle, affectionate, but cumulative. The wife felt herself slipping slightly out of alignment, no longer central to the exchange. She excused herself to the restroom, standing alone under harsh lighting, studying her reflection. She told herself she was tired, that travel and jet lag distorted perception. Friends met abroad all the time. There was nothing wrong with that. Still, she lingered longer than necessary, steadying her breath. When she returned, the conversation paused abruptly, then resumed with careful enthusiasm. The friend suggested they spend more time together while she was in Toronto. The invitation sounded sincere, yet something in her tone suggested inevitability rather than choice. As they parted, the friend hugged her again, whispering how happy she was to see her. The words felt heavy, weighted with something unspoken. Outside, the cold returned, sharp and grounding. The husband walked between them, quiet now, attentive in a way that felt newly strained. Back at the apartment, the wife replayed the encounter in fragments. Nothing concrete stood out, only impressions, glances, unfinished thoughts. Trust battled instinct, and trust still held power. But as evening settled, she realized the city had introduced her to its first familiar face, and instead of comfort, it had brought questions. Tomorrow, she sensed, those questions would begin asking themselves. She did not yet know what form those questions would take, only that they had roots. The friend's presence lingered in her thoughts, both reassuring and unsettling, like a song remembered incorrectly. As night deepened, she listened to the city breathe outside the window and wondered how many truths could exist in one small room. Somewhere between familiarity and doubt, a realization waited. The next day would not be about reunion or comfort, but about observation. And once she started watching closely, she suspected nothing would remain ordinary. That quiet shift would guide her steps forward, even as she tried to resist the truth forming inside her mind slowly. The day after meeting her friend, she began noticing details she wished she could ignore. At first, they appeared harmless, easily explained away by coincidence or stress. Her friend wore looser clothes than she remembered, layers that concealed shape rather than expressed it. When she stood, she did so carefully, one hand instinctively bracing against the table before releasing it again. The wife told herself it meant nothing. People changed. Weather demanded different clothing. Travel altered posture. Still, the observations collected quietly in her mind, refusing to dissolve. During a walk through a crowded street, her friend slowed often, lagging behind, breath shallow, steps measured. Each pause felt deliberate, guarded. What unsettled her most was not what she saw, but how quickly it disappeared when noticed. When the wife's gaze lingered too long, her friend straightened, smiled, redirected attention. The body spoke briefly, then fell silent. It felt like watching someone correct a mistake they had almost made in public. At home, absences multiplied. Errands took longer than expected. Short trips stretched into hours, explanations offered before questions were asked. The husband remained unbothered, unconcerned, as though these disappearances were familiar rhythms. He did not ask where she had gone. He did not seem curious when she returned. The wife felt herself shrinking inside these moments, becoming smaller, quieter, careful not to appear suspicious. Loyalty restrained her questions. Friendship restrained her fear. She reminded herself that intuition could betray as easily as people could. Doubt, she believed, was dangerous when unearned. Yet denial required effort. One afternoon, while sitting together, she noticed her friend flinch slightly when laughter shook her body. It was subtle, fleeting, but unmistakable. The wife felt a chill unrelated to the room's temperature. Her thoughts raced ahead of her permission, assembling possibilities she refused to complete. She tried to test reality gently, offering food, suggesting activities. Her friend declined certain things politely, almost apologetically. Hunger seemed selective, energy uneven. Each refusal left behind a question mark that hovered long after the moment passed. The husband remained attentive but distant, supportive without engagement. When the wife mentioned concern, he brushed it aside with ease, saying stress affected everyone differently. His calm felt excessive, rehearsed, like reassurance delivered too quickly. She wondered when he had learned to sound so certain. At night, she lay awake cataloging details, hating herself for the inventory. She wanted to believe in the version of life she had carried across the ocean. She wanted to believe her instincts were misfiring, poisoned by fatigue and unfamiliarity. Trust had always been her strength. Now it felt like a vulnerability. One evening, her friend left abruptly, citing exhaustion. The door closed softly behind her, leaving the apartment unnaturally quiet. The wife stood still, listening, aware that something irreversible had shifted inside her. Suspicion had crossed into dread, not sharp or dramatic, but heavy and slow. She looked at her husband, searching his face for discomfort, for confusion, for anything that mirrored her unease. He met her eyes steadily, offered a small smile, and returned to his phone. The moment ended without resolution, without confrontation. Alone with her thoughts, the wife understood that her body had begun to respond before her mind allowed it. Tightness in her chest, shallow breaths, restless hands. Instinct was no longer whispering. It was waiting. Tomorrow, she told herself, she would stop dismissing what she saw. She would ask questions even if her voice shook. Whatever truth these signs pointed toward, it was approaching, carried not by words, but by what the body could no longer hide. By the next afternoon, the weight of unspoken questions pressed too heavily to ignore. The apartment felt crowded with things unsaid, every sound amplified by restraint. When her husband stepped out for work, the wife seized the quiet, asking her friend to sit with her near the window. Snow drifted outside, soft and indifferent. She spoke carefully, framing concern as care, mentioning fatigue, asking if everything was all right. Her voice stayed calm, practiced, but her hands betrayed her, fingers tightening together. The friend smiled politely, thanked her, and answered without answering, blaming travel, weather, adjustment. Each word landed gently, then slid away, leaving nothing solid behind. The air between them thickened, charged with avoidance, making even kindness feel dangerous and curiosity feel like betrayal in that moment alone together. She pressed a little further, asking about the loose clothes, the sudden pauses, the careful movements she had noticed but never named. The friend's smile faltered briefly before returning, brighter than before. She laughed softly, waved a hand, said it was nothing worth worrying about. Her answers arrived too quickly, stacked explanations tumbling out without space for response. Stress, she said. Hormones, maybe. Everyone felt off sometimes. As she spoke, her eyes searched the room rather than the wife's face, settling on harmless objects, anywhere but confrontation. Silence followed each explanation, stretched thin and fragile, until the wife felt responsible for filling it. With every deflection, the space between truth and trust widened, though neither woman dared to acknowledge the growing distance that pressed heavily on them both there now. The wife shifted closer, lowering her voice, asking directly if there was something she should know. The question hovered, fragile and dangerous. For a moment, the friend said nothing. Her hands folded over each other, knuckles whitening. When she finally spoke, her words were gentle but empty, assuring love, loyalty, friendship. She insisted nothing was being hidden, that imagination could be cruel. The wife listened, nodding, absorbing the denial like medicine she hoped would work. Yet beneath the calm tone, she heard strain, a tremor that contradicted reassurance. The silence afterward felt deliberate, a wall rather than a pause. In that stillness, both women sensed that whatever remained unsaid now carried more weight than any confession spoken aloud between them at that table in the quiet room on that day. Later, the husband returned, his presence shifting the air instantly. Conversation reset, lighter, safer. The friend excused herself soon after, citing fatigue, her departure abrupt yet courteous. Once alone, the wife searched her husband's face for reaction, for curiosity, for concern. He offered none. He spoke about dinner plans, schedules, weather. The earlier tension dissolved on his terms, leaving her alone with questions she felt discouraged from asking. His ease unsettled her more than anger would have. It suggested preparation, familiarity, a comfort with avoidance she did not share. She realized then that the fracture had formed, not through argument or revelation, but through coordinated silence that protected others while isolating her completely inside her own marriage that afternoon without witnesses or mercy for anyone involved there at all now. That night, she lay awake, understanding that something irreversible had begun. The question she asked had not produced truth, only resistance, and resistance carried its own meaning. She felt the loss of innocence, of ease, of unquestioned trust. Tomorrow, she knew, avoidance would no longer suffice. Silence had drawn its line, and she was standing on the wrong side of it. Whatever came next would demand clarity, courage, and consequence. As sleep finally approached, she sensed that observation would soon give way to confrontation, and that the answers she feared were already preparing to surface. The fracture would deepen quietly, guided by what she now refused to ignore, pulling her toward questions that could no longer remain unasked as the days unfolded ahead, with consequences waiting nearby for them all. The tension that followed the unanswered question did not linger quietly. It waited. By evening, the apartment felt compressed by it, walls listening, air thick with inevitability. When the husband returned, she did not soften her voice or postpone the moment. She asked them both to sit. The friend's face tightened before she spoke. The husband exhaled slowly, already bracing for what he knew was coming. No one began immediately. Silence stretched until it became unbearable. Then the friend spoke first, her voice trembling, words spilling unevenly. She admitted there was something she should have said earlier, something she never meant to reveal this way. Her hands moved instinctively, protective, finally confirming what the body had been hinting at all along. She was pregnant. The word landed heavily, reshaping the room. The wife felt the sound before the meaning, a hollow pressure spreading through her chest. She turned toward her husband, waiting for denial, confusion, anything that restored order. He did not offer it. His eyes dropped briefly, then returned to her face, steady and resolved. That silence answered everything the confession had not yet explained. The truth unfolded in fragments. The affair had begun months earlier, quietly, deliberately. Distance had created opportunity, he said. Loneliness had blurred boundaries. Affection had grown into something unplanned. He spoke carefully, structuring events into a sequence that minimized intention and softened responsibility. Each sentence felt rehearsed, refined through repetition long before this moment arrived. The wife listened without interruption, her body frozen while her mind raced. Dates emerged. Messages took on new meaning. Missed calls found their explanation. The timeline formed a shape too clear to deny. She realized the deception had not been impulsive but sustained, requiring coordination, silence, and choice. Trust collapsed not in one instant, but in cascading waves. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded distant, unfamiliar. She asked how long they planned to continue lying. The husband answered calmly, saying he never intended to hurt her, that circumstances had complicated everything. He framed the betrayal as an unfortunate convergence rather than a decision. Responsibility dissolved in his language, replaced by inevitability. The friend cried openly now, apologizing, reaching for the wife's hand and stopping short. Shame and fear mingled on her face, but clarity remained absent. The wife felt strangely removed from her, as though watching a stranger grieve a loss she herself was only beginning to comprehend. Anger arrived late, muted by disbelief. What replaced it was devastation, heavy and absolute. The life she thought she shared had existed alongside another, hidden and protected. Every reassurance, every gentle word, now revealed itself as part of the cover. Love had been repurposed as camouflage. The husband attempted comfort, stepping closer, explaining finances, stability, responsibility. He spoke of obligations and consequences, positioning himself as a reluctant participant in an unavoidable outcome. His tone never cracked. That composure hurt more than confession itself. It revealed calculation where remorse should have lived. Eventually, words ran out. The friend retreated into silence. The husband sat rigid, waiting. The wife stood slowly, feeling the ground shift beneath her. She understood that this moment was not an ending but a threshold. Truth had arrived, but justice, choice, and consequence had not yet followed. As she moved toward the window, city lights blurred through tears she refused to wipe away. Tomorrow, she knew, survival would demand decisions she had never imagined making. She did not respond to questions that followed. Inside, something hardened, replacing shock with resolve she barely recognized. The night stretched onward, unforgiving. Outside, traffic moved without pause, indifferent to collapse happening above it. She sensed that exposure was only the beginning, that power, money, and silence would soon press in from every direction. Tomorrow would force her to choose between endurance and escape, between accepting a story written for her and rewriting it herself. As she turned from the window, she understood that confrontation had shifted locations. The next reckoning would not be about truth alone but about control and who would be allowed to keep it. Nothing would return to innocence, and consequences were already aligning quietly, patiently, waiting for morning light. Ahead, morning arrived without relief. The truth from the night before did not sharpen into clarity. It dissolved into confusion instead. The apartment felt smaller now, unfamiliar, as though it belonged to someone else. She woke alone, the other side of the bed already cold. Outside, the city continued its routine, indifferent to the collapse unfolding behind closed doors. When he spoke, his voice was softer, controlled, almost soothing. He framed the confession as chaos rather than choice, insisting everything had spiraled because of stress, distance, and misunderstanding, not intent or desire. He talked about pressure, about responsibility, about how hard it had been to carry everything alone. He reminded her of sacrifices, of money sent, of stability he claimed to provide. Slowly, his language shifted the weight of the situation, turning betrayal into circumstance. He suggested that loneliness had blurred lines, that emotions had been misread, that nothing had been meant to happen this way. Each explanation felt reasonable when isolated, dangerous when combined. She felt herself nodding, unsure when certainty had begun slipping into doubt. Her isolation became undeniable. She had no income here, no home of her own, no familiar streets to retreat into. Everyone she trusted existed an ocean away. He knew this. He spoke of logistics, of how difficult it would be for her to leave suddenly, of how complicated things could become if emotions dictated decisions. Concern disguised itself as caution. Control arrived quietly, wrapped in practicality. When she tried to assert what she felt, he reframed it gently. He said shock was distorting her perception, that pain exaggerated reality. He asked her to be rational, calm, fair. The words sounded caring, but they hollowed her out. Each time she questioned events, he corrected her memory, adjusted timelines, softened details. The affair became a mistake. The pregnancy became an accident. The lies became omissions. Truth thinned with every revision. She began to second-guess herself. Had she missed signs because she wanted to? Had her surprise visit caused unnecessary damage? He never said these things directly, but he did not need to. His pauses did the work. His silence filled the gaps she struggled to understand. Responsibility felt slippery, sliding subtly toward her. The friend remained absent, reduced to brief messages heavy with apology and fear. Her distance reinforced the imbalance. Alone with him, the wife felt reality bending, reshaped through repetition. He spoke with confidence, as though certainty itself could overwrite harm. The more composed he remained, the more fractured she felt. At night, she stared at the ceiling, replaying conversations, unsure which version to trust. Her instincts warned her, but doubt dulled their urgency. She wondered if strength meant endurance, if leaving would confirm accusations of instability he never voiced but carefully implied. The city pressed in around her, unfamiliar and vast, amplifying her dependence. He suggested they take time, avoid rash decisions. He spoke of the future abstractly, never including her clearly, never excluding her either. Suspended between belonging and displacement, she felt herself shrinking, adjusting, accommodating. The manipulation was subtle, almost invisible, but effective. By the end of the day, exhaustion replaced anger. She realized that truth alone did not guarantee power. In this place, without resources or allies, reality could be negotiated, reshaped by whoever spoke most confidently. As night returned, she understood that the next battle would not be about what happened, but about who controlled the narrative. And that realization frightened her more than the betrayal itself. Morning brought a strange clarity, sharpened by exhaustion rather than resolve. She began replaying past conversations, not as memories but as evidence. Words that once felt caring now sounded conditional. Promises carried footnotes she had ignored. She remembered how often reassurance arrived paired with reminders of sacrifice, how affection followed compliance, how disagreement ended with distance. What she once called compromise revealed itself as conditioning. She recalled early days apart, when he insisted decisions be delayed until he could advise her. He framed it as protection, experience, love. Over time, she learned to wait for permission disguised as concern. Her independence narrowed gradually, almost imperceptibly. Each concession felt temporary, reasonable, until the pattern hardened into expectation. Phone calls replayed differently now. His calm tone, once comforting, had functioned as control. He spoke slowly during conflict, encouraging her to breathe, to settle, to trust him. When she grew emotional, he labeled it stress, fatigue, misunderstanding. The effect was cumulative. Her reactions became the problem, not the circumstances provoking them. The affair, she realized, fit seamlessly into this structure. It was not an isolated betrayal but an extension of entitlement. He had grown accustomed to managing realities, maintaining parallel versions of truth. He decided what she needed to know when she needed to know it and how she should feel about it. The deception required confidence, not chaos. It demanded a belief that her perception could be shaped. She noticed how often he spoke of responsibility without accountability. He positioned himself as the axis around which others revolved, absorbing credit and deflecting consequence. Love, in his language, meant endurance. Loyalty meant silence. Forgiveness meant adaptation. These definitions served him well. Her friend's role clarified painfully. The secrecy had required cooperation, emotional alignment, and sustained dishonesty. It was easier to betray someone already accustomed to doubting herself. The realization stung with self-recognition. She had been chosen not despite her trust, but because of it. As she traced the arc of their relationship, moments resurfaced she had dismissed. Decisions she had deferred. Feelings she had softened to maintain peace. Each memory sharpened into coherence. Control did not arrive loudly. It arrived wrapped in care, reinforced through repetition. That afternoon he spoke again about patience, about shared history, about weathering storms. She listened differently now. She heard strategy beneath sentiment. He was not asking for forgiveness. He was requesting continuity. Stability favored him. Uncertainty threatened his authority. For the first time, she felt anger without confusion. Steadied her. She understood that love had been leveraged against her, transformed into a system that benefited one voice above all others. The betrayal hurt deeply, but the manipulation explained the depth of that pain. It had prepared the ground. As night approached, she made a quiet decision. She would stop defending her reactions. She would stop minimizing harm to preserve comfort. Awareness settled heavily but clearly. Control thrived in silence, and silence had already cost her too much. She did not yet know how to leave or what leaving would require. But she knew what staying demanded, and she refused it. Tomorrow would force action. Truth alone was insufficient. It needed movement. The moral failure she now recognized could no longer be compartmentalized. It had shaped everything. When she finally slept, it was not from peace but from resolve. The narrative he built no longer held authority over her thoughts. The next step would test that resolve publicly, materially, painfully. She sensed that reclaiming autonomy would provoke resistance, and that the cost of truth would soon become tangible. Control, once named, would not release her easily, but she was no longer willing to call it love. In the quiet hours before dawn, she rehearsed conversations she had never been allowed to finish. She imagined boundaries spoken aloud, consequences acknowledged, futures defined without permission. Fear remained, but it no longer dictated direction. Understanding had shifted the balance. Whatever confrontation awaited, it would no longer begin from confusion. It would begin from choice, and that distinction mattered more than comfort ever had. She accepted that clarity would invite conflict, but conflict was preferable to erosion, silence, and the slow disappearance of self. She woke before dawn, heart steady but heavy, knowing avoidance was no longer possible. The night had clarified nothing except one truth. Silence would protect comfort, not dignity. Remaining meant adapting again, shrinking again, accepting a version of life written without her consent. Leaving meant instability, judgment, and loss she could already feel forming. Between fear and self-respect, she stood suspended. The apartment felt different as morning light crept in. Familiar objects no longer offered safety. They felt like evidence. Each room held reminders of conversations that had shaped her compliance. She moved quietly, not hiding, but preparing. This was not escape yet. It was recognition. When he spoke, he did so carefully, sensing change. He reminded her of practical realities, of expenses, of uncertainty. His tone was reasonable, persuasive. He framed silence as maturity, discretion as strength. He asked her to consider consequences, not morality. Stability, he implied, was the responsible choice. She listened without interrupting. For the first time, she did not internalize his framing. She heard strategy beneath concern. Survival, she realized, was being offered at the cost of truth. It demanded erasure, not endurance. The choice clarified sharply then, painful but clean. Fear surged as she imagined returning home empty-handed, explaining fractures she could barely articulate. Shame waited there, along with questions she could not yet answer. Yet another fear rose stronger, staying and slowly forgetting herself. That fear felt final. She spoke deliberately, choosing words that anchored her. She named betrayal plainly, without negotiation. She rejected reinterpretation, refused dilution. Her voice trembled but held. He responded with disappointment rather than anger, a subtle warning. He cautioned her against rash decisions, against emotion-driven mistakes. She recognized the tactic and did not retreat. Agency arrived quietly, not triumphant, but firm. She did not threaten exposure. She did not plead. She stated boundaries, conditions, truths. The room absorbed them without reaction. Control faltered in the absence of compliance. Logistics followed, cold and necessary. She asked about documents, finances, timing. Each question felt like crossing a threshold. Survival shifted shape. It no longer meant staying safe. It meant staying intact. The cost was real, immediate, and unavoidable. Later, alone, she allowed herself to grieve. Loss pressed in from every direction. Friendship, marriage, imagined futures. But beneath grief, something steadier formed. Dignity did not eliminate fear. It gave fear context. She could carry it without surrendering direction. By evening, arrangements were incomplete, outcomes uncertain. Yet her decision held. Silence would no longer be her currency. Whatever followed would be faced openly. She understood that truth rarely arrives without consequence, and that justice often begins privately, long before recognition or resolution. As night settled, she packed only essentials. The act felt symbolic rather than final. Tomorrow would bring fallout, negotiations, pressure. Others would attempt to reshape her resolve. She braced for it, knowing that choosing truth had already changed her. Survival would be redefined again, not as endurance but as authorship. The city outside continued, unaware. Inside, a line had been crossed. The next chapter would not be about deciding, but about enduring the response. Once truth was chosen, It demanded witnesses, resistance, and cost. She slept lightly, prepared for consequences that would test how firmly she could hold what she had finally claimed. She reviewed messages, memories, and moments she once defended, seeing now how often compromise replaced consent. Each recollection sharpened resolve instead of weakening it. She understood that exposure was not revenge but restoration, a refusal to carry lies that were never hers. Courage felt unfamiliar, heavy, earned minute by minute. She promised herself vigilance, knowing manipulation would return wearing patience and reason. The decision demanded stamina, not drama. Truth would require repetition, witnesses, and boundaries reinforced daily. She inhaled deeply, accepting uncertainty as the price of honesty, and steadied herself for the inevitable pushback waiting beyond morning that could not wait. The news traveled slowly at first, whispers between shared acquaintances, subtle glances from mutual friends who sensed change but did not yet know the story. By mid-morning, messages arrived in her phone. Questions, muted concern, curiosity that bordered on judgment. The exposure was partial but undeniable, threading outward like a slow, quiet fire. Her family in the Caribbean answered with worry and disbelief, unable to comprehend the depth of deception that had unfolded thousands of miles away. Their concern merged with anger, and she felt herself balancing loyalty to truth against the weight of fractured trust. Her husband's composed mask faltered in the glare of observation. With friends and colleagues aware of the situation, control slipped. Questions he had avoided became impossible to deflect without confrontation. In offices, cafes, and phone lines, others began to notice patterns he could not explain away. The very careful narrative he had maintained for months unraveled under scrutiny. Every omission, every carefully timed reassurance, now appeared as evidence of deliberate deception. The friend's world, too, shifted. Her family, long left out of knowledge, began asking questions she could not answer. Her attempts to explain away gaps in communication only highlighted the inconsistencies she had once managed with ease. She felt trapped, caught between apology and accusation, guilt and deflection. The small community that had once provided comfort now seemed a stage for judgment. Emotional fallout stretched across borders, from Toronto to the Caribbean, entwining families in a pain none had anticipated. The wife observed these ripples from a strange distance, neither fully inside nor fully removed. Relief mingled with grief. She had reclaimed agency, but the cost of truth revealed itself in real time. Friendships fractured abruptly. Shared family events became awkward. Silent reminders of loyalty tested and trust broken. Conversations that had once been casual were now weighted with awareness, suspicion, and subtle distance. Even those not directly involved became careful in her presence, unsure how much to say or how to respond. At home, the husband retreated into defensive politeness. The apartment, once a battlefield of subtle manipulation, became a stage for accountability he had never faced privately. He spoke in measured tones, attempts at justification carefully sculpted but increasingly hollow. Each defensive line she recognized for what it was, a shield against consequences, no longer an argument for morality. Her own family's anger and disappointment arrived in letters, calls, and unexpected visits. Each message reminded her that the triangle of betrayal had long-term consequences, extending far beyond those who had directly participated. Decisions once contained within a single apartment now rippled outward, affecting livelihoods, emotional well-being, and connections previously taken for granted. Even within herself, she felt the internal fractures of loyalty, love, and responsibility. Trust, she realized, was not just personal, it was social, relational, multigenerational. Her clarity had come at the price of peace. She had chosen truth, but truth demanded endurance, patience, and confrontation with discomfort she could not avoid. By nightfall, the apartment felt heavy with absence. Silence, once a shield, now carried resonance. She understood the magnitude of what had been set in motion. The lives changed, the relationships damaged, the innocence lost. The cost of betrayal was not confined to a single moment or even a single choice. It stretched across families, cities, and borders, touching everyone who had trusted the web that had been carefully constructed and then deliberately unraveled. Alone, she reflected on the depth of consequences, feeling the gravity of responsibility. Exposure had revealed deception, but it had also forced reckoning. For every lie, there was an echo. For every omission, a shadow. The following day would require navigation, dialogue, and continued resolve. She understood that moral failure leaves a footprint, visible or invisible, and that living with it demands vigilance, courage, and a willingness to face the results of choices that no one can reverse. The night settled around her like a reminder. The truth, once spoken, does not belong to one person alone. It belongs to everyone it touches, and the consequences are permanent. Months had passed since the confrontation that changed everything. The initial shock of exposure had faded, replaced by the slow, persistent ache of consequence. She moved through her days differently now, attentive to boundaries, cautious in trust, and unshakably aware of how deception reshapes reality. Relationships that survived the betrayal had shifted subtly, altered by knowledge of what had occurred. Laughter came with a shadow. Conversation carried a silent filter, an unspoken recognition that nothing would ever return to its prior ease. She reflected on accountability, understanding that truth alone does not undo harm. The husband's decisions had been deliberate, his justifications rehearsed, and while exposure revealed deceit, it did not erase its impact. He remained a figure of complexity, both loved and condemned, his manipulation leaving traces in the psyche of those around him. The weight of his choices extended beyond remorse or apology. It lingered in the way she approached attachment, in how her friends recalibrated trust, in the quiet caution with which she now navigated connection. The friend, too, bore visible and invisible scars. Regret had reshaped her presence, softening her interactions but never erasing the damage caused. She approached others carefully, aware of how a single lapse in judgment could ripple outward. The pregnancy, once a secret, became a symbol of consequence, not joy. She, like her friend, had learned that actions, even when unintended, leave echoes far beyond immediate perception. In the weeks and months that followed, the wife found herself reconstructing identity around integrity rather than expectation. She analyzed choices made, both hers and others, tracing patterns of influence, control, and compliance. The emotional crime she endured, manipulation, gaslighting, betrayal, was not violent in the physical sense, but its effects were equally profound. Self-doubt, anxiety, and hyper-awareness became companions she could not discard lightly. She learned to name manipulation as it occurred, to refuse rationalizations that obscured reality, and to measure interactions with careful scrutiny. Distance became both shield and teacher. Separated from the immediate actors of the betrayal, she observed the subtle consequences of secrecy on broader networks. Families fractured, friendships tested, loyalties recalibrated. Trust, she understood, is not binary. It exists as a continuum, shaped over years but vulnerable to a single fracture. The lesson was not abstract but lived, internalized in behaviors and decisions, in the ways she allocated attention and affection. She also recognized the permanent psychological imprint of manipulation. The silent negotiations she had endured, the unspoken rules of behavior, the careful calibration of emotion, had left deep grooves in her responses. Vigilance became second nature, skepticism a survival skill. She saw that emotional crime, unlike physical harm, can persist invisibly, altering perceptions, memories, and future choices. Healing required acknowledgement of that subtle damage, not denial of it. Even as life moved forward, she understood the cost of moral compromise. For those who choose deceit over honesty, convenience over conscience, consequences persist quietly, sometimes beyond the realm of imagination. Relationships, once violated, cannot fully return to previous states. Trust can be rebuilt, but the memory of betrayal remains. She carried that memory with measured acceptance, aware that it informed who she had become. In the final reflection, she found neither closure nor triumph, only clarity. The truth, once spoken, changed the world irrevocably. Betrayal left scars, manipulation left lessons, and moral failure left consequences that extended far beyond the moment of transgression. What remained after the truth was neither innocence nor victory. It was understanding, vigilance, and the steady, sometimes painful acknowledgement of how lives intertwine, distort, and recover after the quiet devastation of deception. In the quiet of her apartment, the city moving outside, she breathed deeply, aware that the past could not be undone. Yet she had claimed agency over her present. She had witnessed the cost of betrayal firsthand, endured the manipulations, and chosen to act with awareness. What remained after the truth was a life reframed by knowledge, a moral compass tempered by experience, and the recognition that integrity, once prioritized, becomes the foundation for surviving the ripple effects of human failure. Betrayal is not defined by a single act, but by the sustained choice to deceive, manipulate, and emotionally control others. This story reminds us that moral failure carries lasting consequences, and that silence in the face of wrongdoing often deepens the harm rather than preventing it.